Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sam Chandon. Dr. Chandon is President and Chief Economist of Chandan Economics and an adjunct professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. A noted economist and active commentator on issues of national and global economic significance, Dr. Chandon is amongst the commercial real estate industry's leading voices in relation to capital and credit markets and the dynamic relationship between the economy, regulation, and market performance. In his academic and private sector roles, Dr. Chandon has served as an advisor to a wide array of the nation's banks and non-bank lenders, securitized debt market participants, investors, and policymakers. Dr. Chandon received his PhD in applied economics from the Wharton School and was a doctoral scholar at Princeton University. In addition to his current teaching in the fields of public policy and real estate finance at Wharton, he has served as a visiting professor in the economics department at Dartmouth College. Dr. Chandon? And if you haven't silenced your cell phones, please do that now.
First, I want to say what an honor it is to be here again this year. I very much appreciate the generous invitation extended by Kelly Bergstrom and the board and staff at the Bergstrom Center, Tim Becker, Angela, and of course, Professors Archer and Ling. I know I mentioned last year, and I only want to reiterate because of how true it is. I challenge any one of you to visit my office in New York. There's a textbook I keep on my desk, and it's Ling and Archer's Real Estate. But it is an extraordinary program. I've had the very good luck and the very good fortune of being able to stay in touch with a number of the students that I've met over the course of the last couple of years who have stayed in touch to let me know about how their careers are progressing and what classes they're taking without asking for any help at all on their homework or any of their assignments. So it's a real pleasure to be able to see some of them again today and yesterday evening and to hear about what some of their plans are after they graduate in May. I'm here to talk about the Florida economy. And the Florida economy is something that we can't really discuss except in the context of what's going on in a much broader context of a U.S. economy that is also struggling to recover and a global economy that doesn't look nearly as bright in its prospects over the course of the near and the medium term as compared to what we see for ourselves here in the United States. We only need to watch the news over the course of the last week to understand that Europe faces extraordinary challenges, not only in terms of the economic outlook, but the way in which social and political developments are impacting the capacity of businesses to make opportunities to still make sound investments in multifamily. What it means is that when we're thinking about whether or not we can afford to be of that political dysfunction in our thinking about risks and opportunities in the multifamily sector, we're facing we have to err on the side of caution, saying, you know what, if everyone believes that multifamily is the sector where they need to place their capital in a meaningful and conclusive way, well, that means that there are going to be some undue pressures. 2 years ago, in the nascence of the recovery, I got the sense that a lot of you believed at the global level we would have been able to talk about how the United Kingdom and London trophy assets in Midtown Manhattan strongest exerting upward pressure on prices anywhere in the world. Those properties are doing well in terms of their fundamentals. Everyone wants to be next to Grand Central because of the strong potential for growth. Prices are increasing and improving faster than fundamentals. Well, that's just a set of regulatory measures, right there, policy measures that would be favorable to the same phenomenon is observable in some segments of the multifamily market. Well, 2 years later, you don't buy. It doesn't mean you don't inability once again meet the demand in the market where affordability is constrained by the fact that at least in the initial stages we're significantly but you have to be much more careful than we see in some markets in the country today where caution is something that has been thrown to the European Union during a period of irrational exuberance where it leaves over the outlook for the multifamily sector in a new measures because the world has changed and will never be the same, and everyone will want to be very visible in a psychology and an American dream that has adjusted to a very new reality. Will impact that is not business's ability to grow the economy in the way we can afford to ultimately in commercial real estate, and it's something that our recent history has shown us over the course had better guard against. We also know that Greece isn't the only disparity of commercial real estate, not only in Florida, austerity measures in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, in Iceland, in Ireland, In each of these cases, growth is impinged by the inability of governments over the course of a protracted period to address very fundamental issues about how their economies must function. And it provides a lesson for us in the United States, where we have challenged the notion over the course of the last couple of years that we must ultimately deal with these issues here as well. And it remains one of the significant headwinds to growth in the United States, that whether it be with respect to tax policy, whether it be respect to various social policies, whether it be with respect to the way that we define the environment in which businesses conduct themselves. An enormous and exaggerated degree of uncertainties reflects not that we cannot make decisions, not that we cannot set the ground rules for business and investment, but that we have chosen not to do those things in a way that can foment investment by the private sector. And as a result of these things, and not just because this recession is different, not just because this recession is one that relates to a financial crisis and the need to deleverage, but we find that we now experience a growth trajectory in the United States that is somewhat more modest than what we would like to experience, what we need to experience if we're ultimately to be able to put Americans back to retirees. Well, there are real challenges for us because we see that the European Union is slowing. In commercial real estate and the multifamily sector, this has been something that has actually benefited us in the short term. For end of year 2011, its actuals, the growth prospects for the United States have improved. As the growth prospects in Europe have dimmed. We've got again, whereas we would normally see a strong labor market report in the United States, regrettably not result in a rise in the Treasury yields. We've actually seen that over the course of the last couple of weeks, over the course of the last couple of months, as some of that data in the United States has improved, as some of the growth prospects for the United States have improved, but it's also our Treasury yields have actually gone down because of fear, because of concern, because of uncertainty around whether or not money can be safely invested elsewhere. The perception, the increasing perception that the United States is a safe haven for assets is something that has resulted in the costs of capital for each and every one of us in our industry. The cost of capital remaining extraordinarily low. It's allowed us to refinance. It's allowed us to modify. It's allowed us to work with borrowers who otherwise might default on their loans. It's allowed banks to remain solvent that might otherwise not have remained solvent. We think about the trajectory that we have taken in addressing a potential or projected or anticipated crisis in how it is that we manage distressed debt in commercial real estate. And then we begin to understand and think about what has played out over the course of the last couple of years, an environment of frustration for anyone who raised capital in anticipation of those assets coming to market and becoming available at deep discounts as compared to their long-term values. Well, how different that set of outcomes might be if we didn't have a low interest rate environment. So to be sure, the disruptions in Europe, the fact of a growth slowdown along the Asia-Pacific as well, where Japan contracted by 0.6% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter. Hong Kong is likely to experience a contraction in the first quarter. On both sides of the United States, we find slowing growth and potentially very serious challenges over the course of the next year. In the case of Europe, potential challenges that will extend far beyond the next year as they begin to work their way out of austerity measures that, again, will only be put into place between now and 2013 and 2014. Well, all of those things mean that in the global environment, we find that people are somewhat more concerned. They are taking a somewhat dimmer outlook as to where the global economy is headed over the course of the next year. And that is an extraordinary contrast, I think, to what we see here in the United States, where we have not experienced anything that we would not be able to describe as a modest recovery in growth. Certainly when we look at the labor market, it is a frustratingly modest recovery in the labor market. But at the same time, where as compared to the other economies, as compared to our major trading partners, we find that we are now traveling along a fairly enviable set of trends here in the United States. Now, these disruptions that have benefited us in the terms of low cost of capital are a double-edged sword, and we should be careful what we wish for. Although it seems that U.S. banks and other financial institutions have a limited direct exposure to financial institutions and bank holdings and the debt in Europe. What we also know is that a significant unwinding of European banks, a significant disruption in the capacity of European financial institutions to meet their own capital needs is something that could disrupt economic activity, could result in a tightening of credit standards far beyond what the borders of the European Union itself. And so even though we find that capital may become cheaper in the United States as a result of it being a safe haven, we know at the same time that Europe, left unchecked, Europe spiraling out of control, has the potential to tighten up credit standards that will limit individual borrowers, institutional borrowers' capacity to access that credit irrespective of how cheap it is. If you don't believe those two things can happen at the same time, you only need to look at the single-family housing market. The fact that we have a 3.9% 30-year commitment rate from Freddie Mac on mortgages in the United States for residential purchases has made no bit of difference to the capacity of renters to become homeowners in the United States. Has it meant that more people of high credit quality and with stable streams of income have been able to refinance, have been able to then find that a smaller share of their overall budget is allocated to mortgage payments every month and a larger share either to savings or to discretionary spending? Absolutely. Has it fundamentally reversed the downturn in housing in a way that we can say, you know what, a low interest rate policy has been a part of the solution in the housing market? We can't. We can't because even though mortgage rates are low, a function of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's relationship to the Treasury and to the US government, we also find that our ability to access that credit on a widespread basis for the people who would most benefit from access to that credit, well, that's quite limited. It's extraordinarily constrained. And as a result, we'll find that there are many people here today that are enjoying the benefits of a very robust set of trends in the multifamily market in the United States today. A very complex set of global macroeconomic factors that it behooves us to remain apprised of over the course of the next couple of months, over the course of the next couple of years. Because ultimately, our financial markets remain highly integrated in a way that means that even though we do not have direct exposures to what is happening in Europe today, in a way that we would think could be highly disruptive to the capacity of our own banks and our own financial institutions to lend and ensure the flow of credit in the United States, those relationships do exist in far more indirect ways. So we've got a challenge in the global environment. We also know that when we're thinking about Florida, we need to think about it in the context of what's happening in the United States, because the Florida economy does not exist in isolation. Certainly, we've seen that it has been a microcosm for the larger housing issues that we faced, but some of what is driving the improvement in the Florida economy now, some of what is allowing the Florida economy to rise out of a very deep recession, is the fact that it does exist in a dynamic environment that benefits from inflows of people and capital from different parts of the world, let alone different parts of the country. So when we think about what's happening on the national stage, well, it's easy for us to say because the data shows it to us very clearly. The economy is growing at a faster pace now than it was at any time in the last 18 months. The advanced estimate from the Bureau of Economic Analysis shows us growth of 2.8% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter of 2011. That number is subject to revision. It could go lower, it could go a little bit higher. We didn't get terribly excited about this number, in part because a lot of it was related to inventory buildups from firms. And it's unclear that those inventory buildups can be sustained until we're actually generating the jobs that get people to buy things. So there may be a bit of a lag where we'll actually see slower growth in the first and second quarters of 2012. Another contributor to that slower growth is that our trade imbalance will probably worsen as some of those economies abroad are not buying as many things from the United States as they have over the course of the last couple of years when they were in the dominant position, when they were taking the lead in the growth trajectory. Well, what this number has done for us is something critically important. In spite of the fact that it may moderate somewhat over the course of 2012 and 2013, we also know that a big part of the conversation that would have defined how it is that we convened a year ago has largely come off the table. That discussion about whether or not we need to be worried about the immediate threat of a double dip in the United States is not something that is foremost on the minds of most investors today. Is it a concern? Absolutely. Although our baseline expectation may be that the economy will continue to grow, and that's a fair expectation to have, it's also the case that any one of these exogenous issues, any one of these things that is so difficult to quantify, any of these unexpected shocks that could come from somewhere else in the world, could really derail us from our current growth trajectory. What we also know is that while we have to concede those issues, given this period of uncertainty, it's also the case that with growth improving as compared to where we were in the early part of 2011, with the mood significantly improved over where we were in August and September of 2011, when we were living in the aftermath of clear dysfunction on the part of our Congress and its inability to pass any kind of resolution around the debt ceiling issue. Well, now, today, businesses are more confident, individuals are more confident, and as a result, both investment and hiring decisions and consumption decisions are being made in a way that is different from what we would have observed just a couple of months ago. It means that economists are less helpful. Economists are going to be less helpful right now because behaviors matter a lot. And at least in terms of the way that most of us are trained, our best tools are our quantitative tools. And our ability then to measure and anticipate and project how people's sentiment, how their feelings, how their level of confidence will change, and what it is that will change those things, we're not very good at that at all. What we can do, in the best case, is to say, we can look at the array of data. We can look at the array of potentialities, what may happen next, what's likely to happen next, and how is in sentiment, behavior, people's beliefs about what the economy will look like in 6 months or in a year's time affecting their decisions in the here and now. And what we can clearly see in the data is that people's assumptions, people's expectations about where we'll be just a couple of months from now is a little bit stronger than where it was. And we think about what the keys are to job growth in an economy where it matters so much, not just for overall growth, but for our industry in particular, and it becomes all important. We think about the economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research, some of the smartest people in the profession. They, for historical reasons, have been granted the privilege of deciding on the business cycle. And they will tell us when recessions end and when recessions begin. And every time we go through one of these cycles, they engage in a set of activities that ultimately leads to some skepticism about whether or not economists really know what they're up to. And the reason for that is because they may think about the end of a recession in terms of whether or not the economy is expanding again, whether GDP is growing. That's going to be one of their central considerations. But for Americans around the country, this idea of the recession being over because the economy is expanding when we do not have job creation, well, that's not an end to the recession at all. And so what we're going to find is that we have two very different definitions of when it is that the economy is returned to expansion. That's going to impact how people feel about the outlook. And what becomes critically important for all of us here today is that irrespective of whether we take the populist view of when a recession begins or ends, or whether we take the academic view of when a recession begins or ends, what we know is that there is nothing that matters more for our industry and the fundamental drivers of value than the demand for space itself. And that is about job creation. And so if we should find ourselves in one of these camps, if we should fall on one side of what is ultimately a semantic argument about what it means for a recession to end, for our industry, it's about whether or not we're creating jobs. And that means that when we see trophy assets trading in some of those gateway markets at valuations that meet or exceed the levels that we observed in 2007, when we at the same time know that we have a long way to go in restoring the jobs that were lost, then we also need to ask ourselves, what else is going on in the economy today, what else is going on in capital markets, that we have seen such a strong recovery in valuations for a segment of our market, for a specific subset of properties, when ultimately we don't have the people to fill all of those spaces. And it's going to become a critical issue for us, not only here in Florida, but in other parts of the country as well. Well, we've got growth. So right off the bat, we've got a positive message. There's another piece to this. We have growth, and we have growth that is accompanied by strong improvements in corporate profits. This is the kind of data that can foment a debate. This is the kind of thing that can lead to discussions about the way in which wealth is being accumulated and distributed. We're not going to have that debate here today, but what we are going to point to is the fact that corporate profits as of the third quarter of 2011 were actually higher than they were in 2007, at the last peak. Now, it's not the case that every company is doing well. It's not the case that every company is more profitable. But in the aggregate, corporate profits are higher today than they were in 2007. If you ask anyone, and here we'll find a consensus, not only amongst the folks who say the recession isn't over because there are no jobs, and the folks who actually own the means of production, we're going to find that if you ask them, does it feel like 2007? Does it feel like we're more profitable today? They're generally going to say, no, it doesn't feel like 2007 at all. In part, it's because of how we got to these high levels of profits. We've been very lean with our labor force. We've extracted all kinds of productivity gains over the course of the last couple of years. But what we also know is that when we talk to businesses today, in Florida, in other parts of the country, and we ask them, what is holding you back? Your profits are higher now than they were in 2007. There are a set of policy undertakings in place, there are a set of policy measures in place that make it cheaper for you to invest in capital and equipment today than it's been in years. There are a set of measures in place that make it cheaper for you to hire someone today than it has been in years. And you're not doing either of those things. A year ago, businesses would have told us that it was constraints on their ability to access credit, particularly for small businesses, that were holding them back. We've got these profits. But if you're a small business, and small businesses do create a disproportionate share of new jobs, by definition, they're generally newer businesses. Well, without those businesses being able to access lines of credit to stabilize the difference between a fixed set of payroll and expense obligations and uncertainty about when their revenues would come in, that was a critical constraint on their ability to expand their capacity by investing in new equipment, even when they might be able to write it down immediately, in their ability to hire new people. Because, again, no access to that bank that otherwise providing their line of credit in the midst in the early recovery period of the financial crisis. What's changed in the last year is that if you ask most businesses today, why is it that you are not engaging in hiring? Why is it that you are not buying capital and equipment? A lot of businesses will still say it's because of constraints on the availability of credit, particularly for those smaller and more entrepreneurial businesses in the United States. But what they'll tell you is that right now that's not the dominant thing that's holding them back. Instead, it's an issue of confidence. They will tell you that I know that I can buy labor or capital more cheaply than was the case 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago. What I fundamentally do not know, and a payroll tax cut does not change this reality, is that in 6 months' time, in a year's time, I can't say with certainty that I will need more capacity than I have today. I don't know that it makes sense to invest in new people and new equipment to grow my ability to deliver products and services to the market if I don't know that demand will be moving right alongside. So it might be cheaper for me to do right now, but if I don't know that I need those resources, I'm not going to make the decision. I certainly don't feel that demand is going to expand so quickly that I should have a sense of urgency around my current hiring decisions. And so you find that these businesses are profitable. You find that we've made it cheaper for them to hire new people. But it is the demand side of the equation and the uncertainty around what the business and economic environment will be in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months that is limiting very profitable businesses' willingness to engage in the kinds of decisions that ultimately will propel our economy forward. What's changed over the last couple of months, again, is the fact that they're growing more confident. They're growing more confident in spite of a set of global factors that are acting as headwinds. And it's something that we, again, have to continue to pay attention to. The challenge for us, of course, and this is critically important for commercial real estate, is that we need that jobs recovery. Because when we look at where we are in that jobs recovery today, we have performed in a way that is frustrating, but in a historic sense. The gray lines to the left of this slide show you how we have performed in the labor market in each of the recessions following the Second World War. And what you can see is that from the point zero, when we started to lose jobs, to the time that we bottomed out, to the time that we recovered all of our lost jobs, roughly 18 to 24 months will have gone by. Up to about 1990, from the time that a recession began to the time that, again, from that semantic perspective, it ended, 2 years might have gone by. Now, for those of us who remember the recession of 2001 that ended by the NBER's definition at the end of that year, we'll also remember that the recovery that we experienced in its aftermath was something that we generally termed the jobless recovery. We thought of it as a jobless recovery because for 2 years after the recession ended, we still were not creating a meaningful number of jobs in the economy. It wasn't until 2005 that we observed significant growth in jobs. It wasn't until 2006 then that we began to observe significant strengthening of absorption of office space on the national level. It wasn't until late 2006 that absorption ultimately pushed vacancy rates low enough that we started to observe meaningful rent growth. It wasn't until early 2007 then that rent growth was strong enough to foment increases in value that might bring development back into the pipeline. It wasn't until late 2007, until early 2008, that those plans for development were far enough along that people went out in search of credit. And it was in 2008 that the credit markets finally said no. We can believe that it was better judgment on the part of developers, left and right. But what we also know is that in 2008, our ability to access credit to fund those projects was significantly constrained by what was going on in the housing sector, even if it had not yet bled over into commercial real estate. We need the jobs because we don't have them yet. 48 months from the beginning of this recession. The recession has been over for longer than it lasted, and we have yet to replace the bulk of the jobs that were lost. What we do know is that part of the challenge here relates to the quality and skill set of the labor force of the United States, because there are some segments of the workforce, there are some occupations where we can't find enough people. It's the reason why so many technology companies lobby Congress each year for increases in the H-1B visa caps. At the same time as there are positions that go unfilled because we can't find people with the right skill set, we know that we have an enormous number of people who are unemployed, who have been unemployed for longer than we have ever seen in the United States, but for whom there are very few opportunities. One of those critical areas is in construction. So, where does it take us? It leaves us in the position of monetary policy having to be extraordinarily accommodative, and in some cases, monetary policy perhaps even going a step too far, trying to offset some of the headwinds being introduced by a less than sobering fiscal policy. Well, monetary policy that involves very, very low interest rates can be good and it can be bad. It means two things. It means that if you think of the Treasury as your mattress, and once upon a time you would have taken your extra cash during a period of uncertainty, during a period of concern, and you would have hidden it away in your mattress, but gosh, if there's inflation out there, the value of that money is falling. Well, think of the Treasury as the modern day mattress. If you put your money into treasuries, a 10-year Treasury at a 1.9% yield, but you know that inflationary pressures are running in excess of that 1.9%, then all of a sudden buying treasuries, investing in the risk-free asset, does the same thing to the value of your money as putting it in the mattress during a period of high inflation. The value of your money declines, even though inflation today looks like it's well within the target rates that would be set by the Federal Reserve. They've tricked you. So where do we have to be careful? We have to be careful on two fronts. The folks on the board of the Federal Reserve, everyone who's voting on the FOMC, those guys, and Janet Yellen, know very well that people's expectations around inflation are one of the primary drivers, or one of the believed drivers of actual inflationary outcomes. Got to be careful then, because if we ask the folks from the FOMC, well, what do you think the inflation outlook looks like? They know that, at least from a game theoretic perspective, their best option is to tell you that there won't be any inflationary pressures in the long run. That is a dangerous game to play. So don't ask the Federal Reserve what the inflation outlook is going to be. If they're worried about inflation, they have more incentive to tell you that there won't be a problem at all. What we know at the same time is that holding treasuries is going to result in the loss of real wealth. Now, this comes back to the two-sided goal of having a very accommodative monetary policy in the United States. On one hand, we've wanted to make sure that capital is cheap, that mortgage rates are low for folks who can qualify. But at the same time, as we want to achieve that goal, we fundamentally want to make treasuries so undesirable. We want to make the yields so low that you have to move out along the risk spectrum. You have to hunt for yield elsewhere. You have to put your money to work in an economy where, because of how risk-averse you are in the midst of a financial crisis, you otherwise might not. Well, what does that mean for us? It means that we're having to balance two things as investors. One is that, although we're risk-averse, if we buy the risk-free asset, the value of our money is going to decline. And the folks who are giving us money, the folks who are filling our coffers and expecting that we're going to generate returns for them, they're hardly going to be satisfied with that outcome. We need to put that money to work. So we go in search of an asset that yields, but we're doing it in the context of a period where we're also very afraid of all of the risks. So we balance those two things against one another, and what do? We say, okay, we're going to find something that generates a return. We're going to find something that, in the best scenario, also hedges against inflationary pressures. But we're going to have to find something that, in this environment, is still exceptionally liquid. And where does that leave us? It leaves us with a bifurcated outcome in commercial real estate today. Two indices, one from Green Street on the West Coast, one from Moody's on the East Coast. The Moody's underlying data coming from Real Capital Analytics. And what it tells us is that whether we describe it in terms of bifurcation or trifurcation or anything else, the recovery in commercial real estate is fundamentally imbalanced. It's not imbalanced because we just need to wait a couple of more months for the spillover to occur. It's imbalanced because a fundamental piece of the real estate recovery is still missing. And that piece of the recovery is the jobs that ultimately are going to drive the fundamental value. So where does this leave us? The Green Street Index capturing the best and highest quality assets in the United States, the ones that ultimately during a period like this are going to capture a disproportionate share of the net absorption that we do experience. There isn't a lot of net absorption in the retail sector. There isn't a lot of net absorption in the office sector. But I can think of a few people who will be able to describe how their high-quality portfolios of retail assets, their high-quality portfolios of office assets are performing actually quite well. What we're going to see is that in that segment of the market, in the cardinal markets of the United States, in places like New York and Washington, D.C., and LA and Boston, in those places, we're going to find that the most liquid, the most coveted assets have experienced an extraordinary recovery in value. And you think about how this works and how this recovery can occur even sometimes for assets that aren't experiencing a rebound in their fundamentals. We each know the kind of asset we want to buy. Have this conversation in New York 6 months ago, or 9 months ago, or 12 months ago, and every institution would describe how they wanted to buy high-quality, core assets in gateway markets. How many of those assets are available relative to the pool of capital that chases them? If there is more money chasing a finite number of opportunities to invest, if that money is effectively subsidized and artificially cheapened by monetary policy, the impact of leverage, the impact of the imbalance between the demand and the supply for those assets ultimately results in upward pressure on prices, and that story doesn't require for a minute that we refer to what is going on with the fundamentals. So there you have the index that tells you we've experienced a full recovery in commercial real estate. You look at the other index and you see that we are struggling to recover value. We are struggling to recover value because in markets that are relatively illiquid, where when you buy an asset, you don't know that at any given day you have an exit strategy because there is someone else there who is always ready to buy that asset from you. Well, in those markets, the fundamental value of the property matters so much more. And it is in those markets, then, that what is going on in the economy is far better reflected. What you see happening with so many of those high-quality assets in those core markets is a reflection of risk aversion and current monetary policy requiring that we find a yielding asset that remains liquid. Elsewhere in the United States, the reality of a slow recovery means that values are struggling to recover, in particular in the absence of strong credit availability. And in those markets, for the investor that does have access to capital, whether it be through equity markets, unsecured bond offerings, or a relationship with a bank, or just their own cash, the ability in many cases to carefully select an asset and say, you know what? I believe that there's going to be a recovery in this market. It won't be today. It won't be tomorrow. It won't be an asset that if I acquire today, I'll sell in 6 months' time or a year. But in this market, this asset will ultimately revert to a value that is better reflective of its underlying fundamentals. Then you can look around markets all across the United States and find properties worth investing in today. Well, where does that leave us in Florida? It's one of those markets where we have struggled to see value recover. But what we know when we look at some of the underlying drivers of growth in the Florida economy is that whether it be the apartment sector or the office sector or some segments of retail, the opportunity to say that when there is excess liquidity in a market, let's hazard Midtown Manhattan or the Embarcadero in San Francisco, that excess liquidity, the cheapness of that money, can ultimately drive prices higher than their fundamental value. We also know that in an environment where credit is extraordinarily constrained, that the constraints on the availability of credit, the absence of liquidity, can drive prices lower than their fundamental value. And it is that, more than anything else, that is the premise for investment in so many secondary and tertiary markets today. That not every asset is a bad asset. There are many assets that are well-positioned, well-located, and ultimately, like the best properties in New York, will capture a disproportionate share of the absorption that we do experience, but where in the absence of our ability to leverage, the value remains relatively low. So where are we in Florida, and why has it been so troubling? Well, let's turn back the clock for a minute and look at 2005. And what you can see in the 2005 data is part of the answer for why it has been so challenging in the state over the course of the 6 years that have followed. What you can or can't see on the slide is the nature of the growth drivers in the Florida economy relative to what we see for the rest of the United States. And what you might be able to tell is that real estate and construction activity in Florida in 2005, by the time we were reaching the peak of the single-family and condo housing boom, well, it represented a much larger share of overall activity in Florida than it did in almost any other part of the country. What does that mean for us? Well, another way that we can quantify this same set of numbers is that if we take that GDP concept at the national level and we take it down a notch and think about it in terms of the state level, more than 1 in every $4 of economic activity in Florida in 2005 was related to real estate. And so if you suddenly experience a decline, a sharp decline in real estate activity, but more than 1 in every $4 of economic activity is embedded in the real estate sector, let alone all of the multiplier effects into other areas, you are going to experience a dramatic downturn. What are the other contributors to growth? What are the other areas where Florida is overweighted relative to what we see in other parts of the country? Accommodations, leisure, hospitality, tourism. The combination of these things left us with only one growth driver in the state of Florida over the course of the last couple of years, and that was expenditures largely mandated through entitlements on an aging population that required access to health care. Unfortunately, those are not expenditures that add to the productive capacity of the economy. And so while they are necessary and important and part of our social contract, they are also not expenditures that are making us a more vibrant and well-functioning economy. We need to find other things to be able to do. So where does that leave us in Florida? We've had a very difficult downturn. That drop, that bell on the left, shows you the coincident economic indicators for the state of Florida. That includes a whole bunch of different metrics. It's a nice, easy one to bring it all together. And you can see that we've experienced a dramatic decline, reversing all of the upside from the housing boom and all of the wealth effects that went along with that. And I know we had a bit of an argument or just a vigorous discussion yesterday at dinner about the significance of the wealth effect. But I think if there's one market, if there's one set of markets in which it has been more rather than less important, it's been here in Florida, where that increase in how wealthy people felt, that increase in their sense of, what is my equity? What are my savings? How much is my home worth relative to the debt? Those improvements allowed for us to spend more relative to our incomes, even if our incomes were unchanged, because we fundamentally felt wealthier. For the average American household that owned a home in Florida during this period, the fact that home prices were rising so quickly, the fact that they were building so much more equity in their homes than they could have ever dreamt of building through contributions to their 401ks, meant that even though their incomes were relatively stagnant over this period, they were spending more. $700 billion in 2004 and again in 2005 extracted from home equity to fund current consumption. That doesn't just mean holidays and TVs, it means college tuition as well. But it occurs in an environment where not only were we extracting equity from our homes in a cycle that made the downturn worse because of the increased leverage, we were doing it at the behest of policymakers who made the money that we extracted from our home equity deductible when it came time to file our tax returns each year. So a very, very difficult set of circumstances where ultimately government policy itself encouraged us to extract home equity and worsened the downturn in what we might think of as a pro-cyclical policy. Well, where do the leading index numbers tell us that we're going? Because you can see over here that in the most recent set of data, there's an upturn in the coincident index. These are not perfect predictors of where we're going to be, because all sorts of things can happen. But if we continue to move along our baseline, we know that the growth trajectory in Florida over the course of the next few quarters will be much stronger than what we've observed today. That's not to say that we don't have challenges, the most significant of which relates clearly to developments in the housing sector, or lack thereof. And I know that Dr. Case will be speaking to this later on today. But absent or controlling for what is going on or not going on in housing, absent the potential impact of various policy interventions that are designed to manipulate housing market outcomes in a whole variety of ways, the outcomes of which are poorly understood, if understood at all. Well, those are things that we're going to be watching for, but aside from that, the other drivers of growth, the private sector's capacity to drive outcomes in Florida, is something that has improved. Well, it hasn't improved in a way that is even. And this is going to be important for us when we think about how recessions ultimately impact the nature of the labor force and the nature of the kinds of things that we can do. If you think of a recession, at least its silver lining, as being a process of creative destruction. We eliminate the things that are less efficient. We eliminate the things and the functions that we should not be performing. And we reposition ourselves ultimately as a more efficient economy. Well, we can see that some of the trends in Florida are consistent with that notion, but some are clearly not. Some are being driven by entitlements and the nature of the demographic shifts that we experience in the state. The primary driver of job growth in the state over the course of the last couple of years has been spending in education and in the healthcare sector. Another area where we've seen some modest growth has been in hospitality because of an uptick in tourism, particularly over the last year. Areas where we are just beginning to experience the decline, but where the decline will be protracted is principally in the public sector and in local and state government. You can think about how that housing boom, how that wealth effect impacted the state of Florida. It wasn't just that all of us got wealthier with our homes and our condos. It's also that because we were spending more, sales taxes were higher. Because we were buying those homes and transacting those homes, property taxes were higher. All sorts of things contributing to the growth in jobs related to real estate. All of the brokers, all of the real estate agents, all of the rise in income contributing to income taxes at the state level. But each and every one of those things, a source of growth in revenues at the state level, ultimately being reversed once the housing market was turned on its head. Retail is starting to pick up, professional is starting to pick up, but when we think about what this data means for us and what its implications are for commercial real estate, there are a couple of things that, at least on a headline basis, emerge as being very important for the state. One of them being that, as in other parts of the country, and there are notable exceptions in specific metropolitan areas in Florida, we are not in this recovery generating the kinds of jobs that we think of as being related to office-using employment. Look at education, look at healthcare, look at hospitality, look at retail, look at professional employment, where a large share of those professional jobs are actually in temporary positions. And you'll find that in this recovery, not only here, but in New York and in other parts of the country, we're not generating the kinds of jobs that ultimately are drivers of the demand for office space. We're generating the kinds of jobs that don't really feed into savings in a way that allows people to make down payments as part of a transition from renting to one day being a homeowner. We're generating the kinds of jobs that contribute to marginal increases in discretionary spending and more cost-sensitive consumers in the market, but we are not generating the kinds of jobs that ultimately are going to generate runaway growth in performance for the office sector, for aspirational retail, for luxury retail, or in many cases for home ownership. And it's a lesson for us to learn in our thinking about, well, what is this recovery going to look like, and how does it impact different kinds of commercial real estate in different ways? One thing that I left off of that original slide here, because it would require that I change the scale, but it's also a good lesson in the fact that it's just how you present the information in the graph, is that if we move from this slide to this one, it looks as if things haven't really been that bad. And the reason it looks that way is because with the introduction of Florida's construction employment trajectory, we see where so many of those lost jobs are. And we think about why it is that during this recovery, we are experiencing this very long period, something we haven't really seen in the United States historically, where people are not only losing their jobs, but they're having difficulty re-entering the workforce. People are unemployed for longer and longer periods of time in a way that is eroding their skill set and making it more difficult for them to be contributors in a productive way once again. Well, in part, it's because so many of the people that have lost their jobs are skilled in areas that are not drivers of growth in the current cycle. And as long as that remains the case, we're going to have to deal with, whether it be at a social level or an economic level, the fact that we have large numbers of people that require some kind of reskilling, some kind of retooling of their skill set to become contributors to the workforce again, because it's not something that over the course of this cycle we've proven the ability to do in a way that will allow us to be competitive and put these people back to work. Well, one potential answer to this construction story is to think about where people are coming from. What is driving growth in Florida right now? We've seen that uptick. We've seen those leading indicators that look a little bit more positive. Professor, how much more time do I have? Okay. And one of the things that we can see as a significant driver of growth, apart from anything else, is the fact that Florida is a destination state. We have people moving to the state in ways that we can quantify very, very easily. After Texas and California, Florida experienced the largest growth in its population of any state in the Union. The difference here is that we are attracting people to Florida not just domestically, but also from abroad. Cross-border immigration into Florida is a primary driver of the much stronger recovery in real estate assets in Miami than we see in other parts of the state, a much faster recovery and absorption of many of those condos than a large part of the analyst community would have anticipated just a couple of years ago. But again, there is something endogenous in the characteristics of the state That means that while Texas is drawing a large number of people in part because it is an engine of job growth, even though we are not an engine of job growth here in Florida yet, what we do observe is that both domestically and across the borders, people are coming to the state. And that inflow of people, that inflow of the dollars that they bring is ultimately one of the drivers that we currently experience, not only for the economy, but also for the multifamily sector and for other areas of our industry as well. You compare this to some of the other states that had been the poster child for the kind of growth that we would want to experience. And you can see that places like Arizona, places like New York, places like North Carolina, like Georgia, have seen much more lackluster developments in terms of the way in which they are recovering. Florida's attracting people, and it can attract skill sets as well, in a way that allows it to diversify away from a dependence and an over-reliance on construction and real estate in a way that has been to the detriment of the state over the course of previous cycles. If you don't believe this has happened before and has the potential to happen again, pick up a copy of John Kenneth Galbraith's book, 1929, The Great Crash, because the first chapter of that book describes a property price bubble in a place called Florida. And reading that first chapter, you're forced to go back to the cover to make sure that you aren't reading a book about the recession that we have just experienced. The resemblance is uncanny. But our capacity here to find higher returns in real estate and in development and in land in a way that crowds out our investment in other industries and other sectors of the economy is something that has hurt us and something that we should guard against from a policy perspective, but also in terms of how we think about checks and balances that we may want to place on the development pipeline over the course of the next couple of years. That brings us to a critically important point. We obviously know that increased tourism in Florida is an important contributor as well. But as a closing point, what I want to then be able to describe, so I'm on a bit of a tirade about this of late, is something that's of real concern, I think, or needs to be of real concern for us here in Florida. And it relates to the ways in which some of the same psychology around the housing boom, some of the same psychology that during those best years allowed us to believe that there was no end in sight for the improvements that we were going to experience in an economy where everyone wanted and needed and could be a homeowner, have simply been subsumed into a new asset. And instead now of believing that there is no end in sight because everyone will want to one day be a homeowner, we now are allowing ourselves to be sufficiently naive that we believe that there is no end in sight because everyone will one day want to be a renter. That doesn't mean that there aren't extraordinary opportunities to invest in the multifamily sector. The beginnings of any excess have their foundations in concrete evidence of quality and of a reason to invest. The strength of the multifamily sector is real. Changes in the way that we finance housing in the United States are also very real in terms of their impact on how young renters will one day, but probably later than they have historically, become homeowners. And all of that helps renting. What we also know is that our willingness to believe that we will not one day arrive at some kind of balance, that one day we'll find that there are some folks who still, when they grow up, want to be homeowners. And building to that expectation that the bias will always remain strongly in favor of renting is something that creates an extraordinary level of risk for us. And there are few markets in which those risks are more acute because of the way in which we respond to incentives and develop than we find here in Florida. So what do we see? We see that it's early enough that we can capture this. And it doesn't mean running away from the multifamily sector. Those strong fundamentals are there, encouraging investment. And the capital to make those investments is also more readily available than we see in other sectors. But what we do know is that it has the potential to develop its own independent momentum, where the fact of rising prices, the fact of increases in transaction activity and investment flows become the basis for our wanting to and our believing that there is potential in the sector apart from the fundamentals trajectory that we observe. That's happened in some of those cardinal markets, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, where you can see cap rates today trending below 5% on average, below 4% for the assets and the transactions that are going to be written about on the covers of the major broadsheets in the United States and on the websites that cover real estate on a day-to-day basis. That presents unique challenges for us because there are too many loans and too many investments today that only make sense because the Treasury rate is 1.9%. There are too many loans that only make sense today because of the price at which you can borrow and the level of liquidity that we experience in the multifamily sector. And there are too many loans being made today, there are too many investments being made today, that if interest rates were just 50 basis points higher, would not ever come to closing. If you believe that Treasury rates and interest rates will remain over the course of your investment time horizon where they are today, then you should probably have your money in the mattress. But if you believe that one day the economy will improve, one day interest rates will stabilize, one day because of how much debt we issue, not because we will default, but just because people won't see the need to buy the risk-free asset in such large quantities for the market to clear, the yields on treasuries will have to be higher. If you believe any of those things, then you have to believe that there is some risk we are taking by virtue of the fact that some of these loans and some of these deals simply do not work if Treasury rates and the cost of capital are even a little bit higher than they are today in this extraordinary and unusual environment that we're experiencing. Those yellow bars are the cardinal markets where you can see the degree to which the excess liquidity has the capacity to drive values beyond their fundamental value. What you can see from the larger distribution here is that it is not something that means that there are no opportunities to still make sound investments in multifamily. What it means is that when we're thinking about whether or not we can afford to be casual in our thinking about risks and opportunities in the multifamily sector, we have to err on the side of caution and say, you know what? If everyone believes that multifamily is the sector where they need to place their capital, well, that means that there are going to be some undue pressures. In the same way that I got the sense that a lot of you believed when I said that too much capital, chasing too many trophy assets in Midtown Manhattan was exerting upward pressure on prices. Those properties are doing well in terms of their fundamentals. Everyone wants to be next to Grand Central. But the fact that prices are increasing and improving faster than the fundamentals, well, that's just the low cap rate. You can see it right there. We have a very easy way of quantifying this. Well, the same phenomenon is observable in some segments of the multifamily market. It doesn't mean you don't buy. It doesn't mean you don't develop to meet the demand in a market where affordability is constrained by the fact that rents are rising so quickly. But it means that you have to be much more careful than we see in some markets in the country today, where caution is something that has been thrown to the wind during a period of irrational exuberance over the outlook for the multifamily sector in a new era. Because the world has changed and will never be the same, and everyone will want to be a renter in a psychology and an American dream that has adjusted to a very new reality. That is not the America we live in. It's not something that we can afford to do in commercial real estate, and it's something that our recent history has shown us that we had better guard against if we are to ensure the long-term prosperity of commercial real estate, not only in Florida, but for the country as a whole. Thank you so much. I've gone a little bit over time, but if it's okay, 2 questions?
Sure.
All right, 2 questions. No one? Oh, sir.
I haven't heard any numbers yet for 2011, but I moved here in '85, and from '85 up until 2 years ago, I think we averaged about 250,000 net increase into the state. In the last couple of years, I think it was down at 0 or negative. Do you know what the numbers are, and would you agree that that's a that could solve a lot of ills, right? If we overbuild, but we have 250,000 people coming in each year, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, well, it is a good question because one of the primary growth drivers for the Florida economy, it's localized. It's not well balanced across the state. But one of the primary growth drivers is migration. It's something that during the depths of the housing downturn in particular was constrained. Mobility has been a real issue, both for labor as well as retirees, because in many cases people haven't been able to offload their homes. But what we see, the data that I included on one of those slides related to population shows a projection for end of year 2011, its actuals through the end of June 2011. And what you do see is that in those numbers, we've got, again, Florida in the third strongest position in the country. It's a combination of things. It's regrettably not because of strong job growth. It is largely, at this point, being driven by migration of seniors. So there are demographic shifts, but it's also being driven by strong cross-border migration into the United States, and Miami being one of the principal ports of immigration and settlement for new Americans and new permanent residents. But those are both trends that we expect to see continue. And they're trends that will be augmented as we begin to observe a stronger underlying pattern of job growth in Florida, albeit one that is weak as compared to what we would like, but one that's certainly stronger than what we've experienced over the last couple of years. Oh, I've got to cut it off. They want me off the stage. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your indulgence.